So I think pretty much everyone here was here last week, but we'll do a real quick sort of review. As I mentioned, this sort of grew out of the consideration of how do we live out our baptismal covenant. And these sort of last two questions in the 6 have to do with things outside the church building in many ways. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? To which we answer, I will, with God's help. That talked about the fact that the question on the left, will you seek and serve Christ, is very much in line with how many churches, including Good Shepherd, understand outreach, those things that we do on behalf of other people, whether it's give money to a cause or collect food or clothing, those kinds of things, building for Habitat for Humanity, those sorts of things, very much a core value for Good Shepherd. The question on the right, we talk about as being more along the lines of advocacy. That issue of how do we sort of move upstream from where we see these needs arising and address the issue that caused them to arise. Why are there people hungry over and over and over again? Why is the planet dirty? All of those kinds of things. How do we address those kinds of issues? So that's the advocacy piece. And that's what we're really talking about last week and then this week. And we talked about this again in terms of our baptismal covenant, in the sense of where these sort of fit in the ways that Good Shepherd is doing things or has done things, and all of the various ministries that we've had. As you see over there on the right side, we've done really well over the course of time in terms of seeking and serving Christ in all persons, everything from Music with a Mission, involvement with St. Clair's and Covenant Cupboard, and the Jamaica Medical Dental Mission, all of those kinds of things. But when it comes to striving for justice, that's been one of those things that we have not spent as much time doing. And again, part of the reason we're having this conversation last week and this week. So last week we watched this canon conversation between Canon Alex and the head of the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Concerns, and Alan Yarborough. And the Episcopal Church, through actions of General Convention and Executive Council, have identified 5 areas of concern for immediate attention. And Alan brought these out, those being creation care, racial justice, ending poverty, questions of immigration and refugees, and human rights and peace building. In addition to creation care and racial justice, the Diocese of Colorado, or the Episcopal Church in Colorado, has identified the following 2 areas as its areas of focus for living out our baptismal covenant. Those being LGBTQIA diversity issues, and then the suicide crisis that seems to have been so prevalent among our people for the last couple of years. What I'd like to know is where do these churches' interests and our interests intersect. And before I go any further, there's somebody who's got like a radio or something going on in the background.
that you are happy to let me.
Why don't you just mute everybody and
I will. I wanted
and
to
individually bring us
first.
back?
You never spoke up
Yeah.
once.
So I don't want to talk right here. I want to know which of these areas of interests are really are of interest to you. And go ahead and unmute yourself and let us know.
What is creation care? Sorry, I don't connect with that right now.
Okay, so creation care has to do everything with issues of climate change, to issues of clean water, clean air, all of those kinds of things that have to do with the environment. The Diocese of Colorado likes the language of creation care. For a while, they really wanted to talk about climate change. They're interrelated, to be sure, but there are some things that are less climate related and just more sort of everyday living kinds of things. Questions could be of recycling, could be, again, as I say, of clean water, those kinds of things. So does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah. And I guess government policy, they call it environmental stewardship, but to us, that means raising money for the church.
Yep. Environmental stewardship would be just right on. You know, this planet was given into our care, according to Genesis, and so how do we care for it? How do we care for this creation that's been given us?
Okay, Gary, I've got a question. You want us to pick one? You want us to prioritize, or what are we talking about? Because all of these are important.
Well, you know, which I would say individually, individually for y'all or for us all, which are the ones that really burn in your heart more than some others? I would just say, for example, I'm concerned about them all as well, but my love for the outdoors really, you know, the creation care one bubbles up a lot more for me than some of the others, although they're very important. So, you know, that I would say that's kind of the question that I'm asking.
Well, I would find it hard just to pick one, but probably my top two would be racial justice and immigration and refugees.
Where we are in the U.S. and terminating and working on voter suppression, my top one is human rights, the right to vote, and peace building. And the second, they're all important. The second one is racial justice. I see it not just racial, but I see it as justice for those who are mentally ill. So I think it's a big topic, but certainly racial justice and human rights in terms of voting rights.
Let's say the creation care resonates personally most with me as a career educator. It's spent decades on that. So I'm really tied into that. However, it isn't an immediate need. So I have to choose a second choice too, I think, which is human rights and peace building. Yeah, that's more immediate than the still existential threat to the environment, but that's a little ways off.
Mine are creation care and ending poverty.
I clearly agree with something that Mark intimated, that some of these are really long-term kinds of things, and others are less so, I would say.
Well, and I think also something like racial justice can be found in almost all the other areas, as some of the decisions we make have inconsistent outcomes across groups of people. You know, my personal background leads me to the suicide crisis one, and then the racial justice piece.
I've spent a lot of time working on healthcare issues, which I'm not sure if that's under human rights, because I think everyone has a right to healthcare, or ending poverty, because lack of health insurance and lack of access to healthcare is a pretty much guaranteed poverty issue.
Having had 3 students attempt and 1 succeeded, suicide's a big one. But man, LGBTQIA diversity, racial justice, immigration, I mean, it'd be hard to find a second point. And I'm not even sure suicide's the first. I mean, they're all such critical things, and interwoven, a lot of them. You know, immigration, refugees, and poverty go pretty darn close together, as does racial justice. Human rights fits into immigration and refugees. And I don't know that you can throw a dart and pick 2 and come across or, you know, walk away thinking that, yeah, this is really what it is.
The other thing, Father Gary, is that every single item in the list has been addressed, studied, become a position by the League of Women Voters of the United States. Every single one of them. And we've been around for 101 years now. So, you know, it's not that they go away. They are always with us. They're always with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Seems like there's a line in the Bible about that. The poor you will have always with you.
Yeah. The problem with that line, of course, is some people will say, well, then I don't have to deal with it because I can't resolve it. And
but that's not true. There are countries that have resolved it very well, and they give us examples of that, and we ignore it. Why can they do it and we can't? And you can find them out there. You know, we're 17th in healthcare. We're
One of the books
30th.
Oh, that we
education.
should be
And yet we
17th.
say, oh yeah, we've got it made. We figured it out. Well, we really
Or
have.
why can they do it and we won't? That might be a better question.
Yes.
One of the books I recently read, and I can't remember the title, but it's The Sum of Something. It talks about how in the eagerness certain people had about making sure that populations of color did not dominate other populations, a lot of the things that we did following World War I, we started to undo in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s in terms of making things equitable for all people. For example, shutting down swimming pools so that Black people could not swim in them with white people. And a lot of poverty relief programs are addressed as all of these Black people are taking advantage of it when it benefits more white people than it does Black people. So I know that, you know, the whole idea of systemic whatever discrimination is not always something people agree on, but lots of people are looking at our country through that lens right now and talking about why we are unwilling, because of a long pattern of racial discrimination, to engage in some things that other countries are willing to do, like healthcare and housing.
Part of that is, I think, based on the Puritan ethic.
You're talking, Irma, but we're not hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think a part of that is based on the Puritan ethic, that if you work hard, you're going to be successful. However, and I've used this before, John Winthrop wrote an essay. It's not a sermon, it's an essay. While he was still in Boston Harbor, when he came from England in 1630, I think it was. He was the Great Migration. That justice had to be tempered by mercy. And he instituted the American bankruptcy law. but no one was going to have their property taken from them. No, no, obviously man, no woman either, but no one was going to lose property or a means of livelihood, be put in jail for not paying debts. And in 7 years, if it wasn't paid, it was forgiven. That's unique to this country. And that was a Puritan decision. But when slavery was introduced, and slavery really made the plantation system work because you had cheap labor. And then it became, well, we can't have them intermarrying with white folk. They have to be below us. Everything with that goes with it. So 1618, when the first Africans were enslaved in the United States, brought to the United States and sold into slavery, we began this attitude. I remember in Michener's Centennial, one of his last comments is, someday Americans are all going to be a light color of brown. I thought, yeah, that may be true someday. You know? And we got to get over it. We got to get over that thing about our color, and I love the Anglo-Saxon. Well, before the Anglo-Saxons were the Romans and the Celts. And we have a lot of Roman law in this country, and we aren't talking about that. So I think that it's a terrible situation that Americans haven't been willing to look at. And because we believe so strongly in free enterprise. So anything that smacks of everybody pooling money and doing it together, we rebel against. But the Puritans established free public education. They paid for it through their tithes, and everybody had to pay 10%. So
you can't paint the Puritans with just one brush, as you're pointing out, Erica, but you know, the ethic that has already been raised, but also free enterprise, that piece of it, capitalism and Protestant work ethic. But the other piece of this is just sort of the rise of individualism and how we have made that so much a part of what our American psyche is all about. It's about the individual, and you know, that's part of it as well.
Yep, it is.
I'd just like to add that there's several of us on the call today that are participating in a book study. It's called The Color of Compromise. It's by Jamar Tisby. I highly recommend it.
And if we're going to recommend books, I highly recommend Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, C-A-S-T-E, which talks a lot about the American caste system.
Who's the author?
Wilkerson. Wilkerson.
So, I was keeping tabs as people were talking, and where at least among this group, there were 3 areas that got the most votes. Not that that means anything. I'm just pointing it out. Racial justice, human rights, and creation care were the ones that were mentioned the most often. I just point that out. But it does raise the question, just sort of going further about, and maybe I'm going to move to the next slide. Just are we doing anything, or are raising these questions? Some of you have been part of this congregation for a really long time. Are some of these questions interested? Do you think people of the parish should be interested in engaging these? And it might not be Sunday mornings, because we seem to see, you know, a shift in attention on Sunday mornings, and it also, we don't know what a new pattern is going to look like, but certainly the old pattern eliminated some people from engaging in faith forum because they were in the choir or other issues. So, the question is this something that you think people of the parish would be interested in, or how do we engage additional folks? I throw that out for discussion. I think, anyway, go ahead. I think we've eliminated that extra background noise. Don't know where it was, but I think it's not there. So
It's the frustration of the church. Your sermons, when you preach of the teachings of Jesus and what he says and how he says it, and we understand it, and then when we get to the end of the sermon and we love the service, there's a bridge to cross that says you take that information with you and carry it weekly. I always love this imam I talked to one time, and I said, how come you do the praying to Allah, 5 times a day? And he said, well, how come you Christians forget your teachings after Sunday? That's why we do the 5 times to remind us of what it takes to be a good Muslim. And I think that's the hard part. That's the frustration part, that we have these wonderful people, but they leave the message after Sunday. And we don't do what we should be doing enough. We don't even just carry that message with us. We should be in angst. A real simple one is, in the last recession, in which the mortgages were all taken away, the African Americans, that was their only wealth. And it was $84 billion. And they lost $82 billion in the mortgage crisis. And nobody went to jail. And I didn't see anybody in the Episcopal faith stand up and scream, this is wrong and it needs to be corrected. And how do we address it?
They're good
find
points, Mike.
personally-
And I think there were ideas about addressing it. One was to add the unpaid balance to the end of the mortgage, extend it out more time. And it wouldn't have taken a lot to do that. But I don't know what the Episcopal Church did on it. What I think we have done is try to work with St. Clare and St. Francis, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't become advocates for some other things.
I think personally that there's a difference between outreach in the sense that I can give canned goods to something without any trouble. I know of lots of places where I could do that. Or even just donating something to the church and saying, you pass it on to somebody. Those are easy, but when it comes to advocacy issues, I find myself feeling like I'm alone and I don't know where to go. And I know it has to be done by more people than me. And what I feel I am learning through this is probably there are people within the Episcopal Church who are doing advocacy, but I haven't identified them to join with them and find out how I can do it. Or I have heard of the Women's League of Voters for years, but I never thought about them, about all of the advocacy they're doing and how many of the things they want to do are probably things I would like to do too. I don't believe I can do it by myself. So a lot of times, because I can't do it by myself, I feel stifled and I feel like I should just do the little bit I can, but I want to do more than a little bit because I believe these issues need more than a little bit. So what this is giving me here is hope for finding people who want to do what I want to do, not necessarily just within Good Shepherd, but within this Episcopal group of people that can have national influence. And I do believe that at times the national church does speak out about these issues, but because they're not, the things they're saying don't seem to be very controversial, nobody puts them in the news. I see things that I read that are national church publications that tell me these things if I want to get them. But in terms of them being in a newspaper or on NPR or anything else, what the Episcopal Church says, nobody follows and says it, but every single tweet some idiot says gets talked about.
So I want to thank you, Susan. There was, I didn't prompt this, but I just want to say that we have a lot of resources, and this is available. I'm going to show you some stuff that's available as a one-sheet a document that's on the Good Shepherd website. But here are some resources that we have that in terms of seeing what other folks in the church are doing and hearing about them. There's the Office of Governmental Relations has its site, and then you can sign up for this Episcopal Policy Network. You get emails from that. The Episcopal News Service, also you can sign up and you get these ways of engaging. On Facebook, there is that, the conversation that from many one conversations across difference. That's something that we could try and do here at Good Shepherd. And then in the church in Colorado, there's the site that's just living out our baptismal covenant that has links to all of those areas that I've identified that the local church has put together. But it's not just church related. There are other faith-based resources as well. Interfaith Power and Light, which has a lot of stuff to do with questions of creation care. Interfaith Alliance brings a lot of this together with other people, with people from other religious traditions. And we have a branch of the Interfaith Alliance here in Colorado. The Colorado Council of Churches has various mission task forces. So here are other Christian groups. And then another faith-based organization is Together Colorado. And we've got churches and folks we did have somebody at the office of the bishop who was really engaged with all of these. Problem was he went off to seminary and we haven't been able to replace him. But then, examples of other national or Colorado resources, and I would add, and I will go back in and add to this, Irma, the League of Women Voters. That, the Colorado Consumer Health Initiative, Dear to Deb's Heart, Social Legislation Committee, or the Casa La Paz. I mean, there are a lot of places out there. And I think one of the things, and maybe Susan was alluding to this in a little bit, is that there's so much out there, hard to figure out how to engage or be engaged with other people, not knowing where to look. So we tried to put some of this together in this document, and I'll send this out. I'll get this out in the newsletter, the tie. Although if you go to the website and go to the Faith Forum sections, there's one on this particular set of conversations these last couple of weeks, and this is linked there. So
Mark was just wondering where he could find these resources because he can't write fast enough. I was also going to say, if you're available at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning, the Office of Government Relations every week does a half-hour update on what's going on in the Office of Government Relations. And one of the things that happened this past Thursday was that Rebecca, who's the head of the office, talked about the approach we take, which, Susan, this goes to your comments, that a lot of the time, the Episcopal Church doesn't make a big scene about what they're doing. They work quietly behind the scenes. And they make independent statements when they think it is important for the Episcopal Church to show a unique perspective. Otherwise, they clump in with interfaith alliances and other groups that are cover more religions. So they do a lot of relationship building, and it goes under the covers, so to speak. I mean, they don't go out and scream, "This is what we're doing," and because that wouldn't be a very Episcopal way to do things now, would it?
Maybe not, but I do believe that for younger people in our country and for other countries that are nominally Christian countries,
Mhm.
the fact that mainline denominations are not talking about what they're advocating for is making kids think the only Christian advocates are advocating for things that I believe don't go along with our baptismal covenant. And I think that, you know, when you see some of the statistics coming out recently, I think part of the problem is that by being behind the scenes, we are not showing who we are enough that young people want to be part of us. They don't see us as part of the solution. They don't know what we're doing. So I think that's a problem actually, but I understand that's how we operate. I just think we need to start thinking differently. But I also would like to make one more suggestion, although I don't see Gary there, so maybe I'll just tell him at dinner. But I believe it might be when we were meeting together as physical people, I know one thing Gary started to do was commissioning people on behalf of the church to do certain things, or to honor people in groups like the sports day, all the people who would be involved in sports for the year. Perhaps it's time to start honoring those of us like Irma who are doing advocacy work so that it becomes visible, so the people doing it become visible. So those of us who feel like it's invisible can go to those people and talk with you about what you're doing, and how we might be able to get involved and see that this church is doing these things.
Several years ago, there was a bill before the Colorado legislature to do away with the kind of hold harmless that there is for grocery stores and restaurants to give away food that could no longer be sold at the grocery store or sold through the restaurant. And there was a tacit hold harmless that they would not be sued if they donated old bread, for example, and somebody got sick. There was a bill before the legislature that would have eliminated that hold harmless and held the stores and restaurants responsible for anything that happened to people who ultimately received that food. For example, Covenant Cupboard gets a lot of food from Whole Foods. They used to get food from Sprouts. They've gotten a lot of food from King Supers. They've gotten, over the years, have sometimes gotten food from Panera's. So those are all organizations that would have suffered greatly if those stores would not have given the food to food pantries. So I was part of the lobbying group on that, and I was talking to Covenant Cupboard people asking if anyone would be able to give us an estimate of how much of the food came from those sources so that I could use that in my testimony before the legislature. The response was that was politics and they don't get involved in politics. So they were cutting off their noses to spite their faces, and because there's a view that advocacy is politics, whereas giving away food is
charity.
Yeah. And I don't know how we educate people that sometimes you have to do the quote dirty work of talking to politicians to get the laws passed that make it possible to serve the needy or the hungry or the homeless or those in need of health care.
Well, in the Old Testament, that was called prophecy, and the prophets did it. And they talk to politicians all the time.
Yeah.
So there is an ancient tradition within the Judeo-Christian heritage that we prophesy and talk to politicians and tell them what God wants them to do. So maybe we just need to think about what our roots are and stop being I don't know, somebody else. You know, the prophets certainly offended a lot of politicians.
So I think it would be
And
a
if
really
you stood up in church and suggested we all become prophets, that wouldn't necessarily start a stampede of people to sign up, though.
no.
Gary,
However, I
Eric?
just wanted to mention this. The league puts out a brochure, and I think it's trifold, of our representatives, their addresses, their phone numbers, how to get in touch with them, down to the state level. And that contact is one of the most important things all of us can do and each of us can do.
Mhm.
The league is
Gary?
big into letter writing. I mean, the letter writing is just unbelievable. But anyway, I've been very hesitant about asking if I could bring them in the church because league is nonpartisan, but it does smack of being politically active. So that's one question I've had about being involved.
Mhm.
Gary, this is Whit. You've given us a lot of information, and it's a little overwhelming at this point. The thing that I'm disappointed from our discussion is we didn't get to your question about what things do we think the people of Good Shepherd could rally around or advocate for. I think you've seen from our responses to your first slide that we're all across the board. So zeroing in on one thing is going to be quite difficult. However, in your sermon, you talked about the church in North Carolina that you supplied for a while, and they had sort of a rebirth. And this is something that I've been interested, having been at Good Shepherd since 1983 and feeling like we do need a rebirth, is if we could focus on one thing to start with, such as they did with homelessness and so forth, that it would be something that we could rally around. But there's so many people in our church, including us older folks, that would like just to keep everything the way it is and not rock the boat. So I think that's a lesson for us. If somehow we can really find out if there's one thing or two things that we can really focus on, while individually the rest of us can be advocates and use some of the resources you presented, that's great. But for the church to take a shotgun approach and say, hey, we're going to do all these things, that'll never happen.
Can I, thanks, Whit. I really appreciate that. One of the things that might, I don't know, I'll let you sort of, is that there's a series, a curriculum on civil discourse, which I think one of the things I tell couples that I work with who are getting ready to be married, that, you know, my concern is communication, because if you can communicate, you can deal with kind of almost anything else that arises. And so there is a curriculum, a 5-session curriculum on how do you have civil discourse. And, you know, so it's these various, I'm not proposing this, but it's a way of dealing with one thing that might provide avenues for a lot of people into something, into their own issue, and be able to ratchet down the heat of some of these conversations. Now, that being said, we could look into something else, picking up, every so often, picking a new issue and saying, okay, for the next 4 weeks, we're going to do some education on this. And then 4 weeks, we'll do some education on this, and see who sort of opts into those various pieces. I don't know. I'm completely open to suggestions here.
You can list them in the weekly newsletter, the advocacies, like Susan mentioned. Who heads up an advocacy?
I may have stepped out at that point, but I can go back and look.
I'll talk to you at dinner time, honey bun.
Okay.
Diane, to some extent, we on the advocacy committee have started trying to do that, where I told my story of how I got involved in social justice or racial relations when I was 17, and that story was in the in the sheepskin. Now, nobody's called me about it. Nobody has said they read it. So maybe nobody reads the sheepskin, or maybe nobody read my article. But I think we've started trying to do that kind of thing. Also, the Interfaith Alliance has got a whole curriculum, Gary, on how to tell your story, how to introduce the subject within a church, all of that kind of stuff. That works in, we've got a lot of Episcopalians that are part of the Interfaith Alliance.
Yeah.
But I think what Susan was talking about recognizing people who are doing this kind of work and commissioning us to do it.
Yep, I'd be happy to do that.
I think that what you just talked about in terms of the article in the sheepskin, my experience in working with people, working with volunteers, is everybody listens in a different way. Some people, unless you speak to them, don't pay attention. Some people, if it's not something they can read and refer back to, don't pay attention. Some people, so I mean, and what I got into this thinking because of churches are always trying to limit the amount of announcements you make. The problem is that if you don't tell people what's going on, nobody does anything. You have to talk to them in the way that works for them. So multiple avenues in terms of educating people seems to me always the best. So small groups like this work for some of us well. Some people need the sheepskin and a written article like you made, which was wonderful. And some people need to see people standing up in church and finally they'll see. It's just really hard to limit it to one way. Doing many ways, I think, as this church is evidently beginning to do, or maybe has always done, is going to be the best way.
I think there's solutions to this because I've experienced solutions to it. Right now, basically one league member is working with all of the cities in Arapahoe County to move away from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. And she's gotten them to go a long way. That's a climate issue and it's very pragmatic. And she's got information on costs, etc. We just finished, we meaning Arapahoe Douglas League, a study on homelessness. Douglas County has no housing for people who need help with housing. They have no public housing across the entire county. We have a lot of empty buildings. And one of the recommendations that came out was we should look at all the empty spaces that we have after COVID and see what we could do, and to start with senior citizen housing, where we started in Greeley, and that became acceptable, and then other housing became acceptable. Littleton has had a housing authority for a long time, and it's done a lot of work on this. But there are things that we can do that are small. They don't have to be huge. They don't have to be big. They don't have to be other things. Things that we're interested in that we can do and work on and help with here. And that's what I have to share.
I certainly agree that most of the work that we can do by its very nature starts out small. The part of the issue is how do we communicate to the rest of the congregation that this is an opportunity for them to join in if they are interested in joining in on a particular topic. So one thing that the National Church does is they say something once a week saying, here's something that you can advocate, here's the position the Episcopal Church has taken. If this speaks to you, please send it to your representative or whoever. So that's one avenue, and to somewhat Susan addresses the issue of, is there something concrete that I can do that's relatively easy but can have an impact? Because it comes, and you just do it within your email system. But But to me, there is a piece of it that is raising awareness, raising that it's important for people to have a sense that there are other people who are also interested, and that this is an okay conversation to have within church. And in fact, a critical conversation to have within church, and that we don't have to feel like, you know, I don't know, too many feathers are getting ruffled, or if they are getting ruffled, perhaps we can place it within the context of something that feels ultimately more a call to what we're all being called to do, and not a threat to what we're being called to do.
I think I like what you just said in terms of, I've been reflecting on Gary's thing about the civil discourse education. Because I do think one of the reasons why we don't talk about this is fear. We're afraid of offending people. We're afraid of driving people away from us. We're afraid that we might be isolated or criticized in ways we don't want to be criticized, in what we want to regard as a supportive family of faith. And perhaps starting with learning how to talk about controversial issues might be comforting in some ways, as well as beneficial to those of us who want to speak up but don't want to be bulldozers.
Great, thank you. I have to go get ready for 11:30 service, so you know, there is a time certain piece to this, but this has been really helpful. And one of the last slides I wanted to show was just, you know, here are the people who have been on the advocacy team, and you know, you'll see down at the bottom in red is a big question mark. If you want to be included in emails about meeting with the rest of us, let me know. The team is not the people who are doing the work. The team is putting together the resources and opportunities and how we move forward. And so if this is something that you'd be interested in continuing with, please do let me know. But you've given me a lot of really good ideas, and I'll be working with them with these ideas with the team and figure out how we move forward. But I think you know, the question of civil discourse is really key, and I'd be really interested in pulling this together. And it's something we could do over the course of the summer. There's nothing that would stop it. It's easy enough to do. So I'm going to call this to a close, but I'm going to call it to a close with a prayer. And then I will see you all at some point soon. Some of you sooner, more soon than others. So let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every human heart that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.